In Shakespeare's play, A Winter's Tale, a peddler named Autolycus enters, singing of his wares. What is he selling? Well, let's just say his words toy with the listener. For my lads to give their dears pins and poking sticks of steel, what maids lack from head to heel, come buy of me, come buy, come buy. Buy, lads, or else your lasses cry, come buy. So, what is he selling? Yes, it is exactly what you think it is. There's the rub. Hey folks, today we are interviewing the sponsor of our show, Dr. Gillian Kenny, historian of women, sex, and magic in medieval Europe, about the objects of our affection. We're picking up good vibrations today. I'm B.T. Newberg, and this is the history of sex toys. The History of Sex is sponsored by Dr. Gillian Kenny, historian of women, sex, and magic in medieval Europe. Just a note here, folks, this episode does have some audio quality issues. Dr. Kenny made a heroic effort to get this recorded despite numerous technical difficulties, and it was well worth it. Enjoy. The Upper Paleolithic, 3 million BCE, Africa. A lone ape, her sable coat glistening under the Serengeti sun, encounters a pile of bones left over from some unfortunate wildebeest. She circles it, curious. She cocks her head and scratches her sloping brow, then reaches out a dark-nailed hand and grasps a femur. She hefts it, feeling its weight. She knocks it against the other bones, which smash under the duress. Pleased, she does it again and again. Smash, smash, smash. Hopping and whooping now, she raises the bone to the sky in a salute to violence, but then her eyes flash with intelligence. As if struck by an idea, wait a minute, what else can I use this for? And with that, the first sex toy is born. Thanks for being on the show, Gillian.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me.
Folks, Dr. Gillian Kenny is a research fellow at Trinity College in Dublin in the Center for Gender and Women's Studies, and she is here to school us about all of the ways our tool-using species has enriched our lives with a little bit of creative thinking. It's everything you always wanted to know about sex toys, but were afraid to ask. We've had her on Dead Ideas, my first show, when she talked about the position of women in medieval Ireland as part of our series on the medieval Irish Geis. And at the end of that episode, she revealed that she was researching the history of sex toys, and I have wanted to have her back on a show ever since. And today is the day. Gillian, tell us first, what's our time span that we're going to be working with today? How far back in history are we going to be going? Are we going to go back to like the Mesolithic, like Upper Paleolithic, 3 million BCE? What are we talking about?
Well, it's quite an interesting question, really. I mean, you do have some archaeologists, usually male, who, when they spot a phallic-shaped stone, immediately assume that it's used in some kind of sex ritual. I don't necessarily agree with it. Speaking as a woman, and I assume most women will agree with this, the idea of pleasuring yourself on a piece of granite doesn't really appeal. So they were probably used early dildos. In that, if you can describe them as that. I mean, the earliest one is supposedly about 28,000 years old, but I wouldn't necessarily believe it. But there's certainly probably used in some kind of sexual ritual. There's no doubt the identification of the phallus, the use of the phallus in ritual has been there for many thousands of years in human history. I mean, we first come across proper representations of dildos, though, as you would expect them to be, in Greek references in Greek art. So there
really?
are
Not till Greece? We don't have like in ancient Egypt or anything?
Yeah, they're in Egypt as well. You do get some wall paintings in Egypt with what look like women with dildos on. with a kind of a strap on. But again, I mean, people can say, oh, it's for religious purposes, which is what everyone says when they don't know what it's for. The classic thing is, the classic thing in archaeology and history, if they don't understand something, they'll go, oh, it must be for a ritual purpose. Okay. So we're not entirely sure. But we do get it in Greek literature. There are references to dildos. There are references to women pleasuring themselves. So that tends to contextualize it a bit more. Some of the artwork is quite astonishing. There's a famous one where a woman is, oh God, I think she's given a man a blowjob, and then so she's going to get penetrated with a dildo at the same time, something like that. It's really quite, well, really. But I mean, the interesting thing about that, of course, is...
That one is from Greece?
That's Greece, yeah.
That's Greece, okay.
But the interesting thing, of course, is that people nowadays, as they always have done, think they've discovered sex and are very sexually amazing and tolerant. Not really, think again. We've always been that way. It simply wasn't talked about quite as much as we do, because we have a lot more means of communication than people did back then. But if you scratch the surface of most cultures, you'll find a level of sexual freedom that would surprise people today, I think. So yeah, the Greeks were at, and of course they were. There's anecdotal stories about Greek women using a type of bread as a dildo, which again, I don't really rate.
That sounds the worst of all.
Oh, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? What? What kind? Well, they used to let it go, supposedly. They'd let it go a bit hard, all right? But they also did have a type of dildo which they made from leather and stuffed, and they used to oil it and soften it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awful too, unless you put some like major oil or honey or something.
It's a lot of olive oil in Greece. But you had that going on. So we've always had them. We have examples of dildos right the way through. Of course, the Romans had them and referred to them. But I think the interesting thing about dildos as a sex toy, and it comes right up to the modern period, is the fact that throughout a lot of history, men tended to denigrate or laugh at them because they're seen as a threat. Because there's, the idea is if a woman can gain pleasure by not having penetration from a man, then what's the point, really? I mean, you can go off and buy something and it'll give you double the pleasure. You won't even have to do his washing. So there's an element of being threatened by it. Yeah, and I think you see it to a certain extent today. Dildo marketing is often quite, obtuse. It can be quite cutesy, rampant rabbit and all that. So it's always kind of slightly goes around what it's actually there for. And so it's always been slightly, I mean, even with the iconography of women at, parties like Anne Summers parties as they are in the UK, and they go and they have a giggle and they buy sex toys. I find it interesting because it is an important part of a lot of women's lives. So why not celebrate it? But, there's lots of historic reasons for that.
So men see dildos, consciously or unconsciously, as sexual rivals. That blows my mind. But what about other kinds of sex toys? And what about other users of sex toys besides women? And how did these tools of titillation develop in the later Middle Ages and on into the modern period? We'll have the answer to all of that in just a moment, but first, we'll take a short break, and we'll be back after this. And now, The History of Sex presents this. What?
My queen? 'Tis I, your king.
My lord. Yes, come in.
Are you quite all right, milady? I thought mine ears did hear a crying.
A crying, you say? 'Tis surely the cry of battle, my lord. Is not the army of your rival, the Baron, at our very gates?
Well, yes, but 'tis another rival of which I wish to speak.
Forgive me, my lord, but surely none could be more pressing than that which pounds upon the gate.
Well, yes, but 'tis another pounding of which I wish to speak.
But could there be a matter more urgent than the ram which batters again and again at this very fortress?
Well, yes, but 'tis a ram of another Say now, what is that behind thy back?
What this? 'Tis a gift.
A gift? For me?
Why, yes, my lord. 'Tis, a weapon. A weapon with which to smite thy rival.
A weapon?
Indeed, a holy weapon. 'Tis the very cudgel of Saint Cuthbert.
With what is it anointed?
An oil most holy, my lord, to bless thy victory. Now, off you go.
My dear, so sweet. You fill me with a yearning for victory.
Just as I am filled with a yearning as well, a yearning which can only be satiated by seeing you off
Yes.
now to battle.
Yes, now, to victory, armed with a cudgel the likes of which there is no other.
Indeed, no other cudgels here, none, save for one.
Lots of stuff on dildos through time, of course there is. But there's also the other sex toys are not quite so well attested to. There's some curious tales about cock rings being invented by the Chinese, but I mean, a lot more work needs to be done on it. And using the eyelashes of goats, which is an astonishing kind of tall tale. You think to yourself, did someone look at a goat and then look at their penis and go, I wonder? I mean, where did that come from? So there is...
The Chinese context is really interesting too, because the attitude toward sex and particularly female pleasure was totally different. And I'm not sure if that was true all throughout, like all eras of Chinese history, but at a certain point, for Taoist kind of alchemical reasons, it was really important for a guy to get the girl off because he would absorb her energy in that way, her chi.
Yeah. I wonder if that was it common throughout Chinese society though, or whether it was relegated to the thinking
yeah, it could
classes.
have been the elite.
I just wonder. I mean, it's brought up something else though as well, which is also interesting when you look at other cultures and how they wrote about sex. When you look at, for example, medieval Islamic culture, and they talk about lesbianism as a good thing, which is interesting in that sense because it relieved sexual tension for women. I mean, part of it is that it's not seen as a proper sex act, it seems, because it's two women together. But it is quite interesting. I mean, some Islamic doctors kind of prescribed a bit of lesbianism for women who might be feeling a bit tense. So that's quite interesting when you consider how maybe Islam is portrayed now in certain sections. There's an unwillingness to come to terms with a very rich and complex history and how sexuality was viewed within that culture, like within Chinese culture. But there's plenty of stuff. I mean, there's plenty of stuff in the Western tradition as well. I mean, but in terms of sex toys, attitudes began to change in the later Middle Ages towards it as the church turns more, you could say militant, but it certainly becomes more fixated on sin and types of sin. And I mean, unfortunately, what you do get are instances. There's a very famous incident in Germany where a woman was put to death because she had devised her own strap-on and was having sex with other women with it. And again, that's transgressing what would have been thought of as gender boundaries. That's taking the place of a male. And again, it's a really, really threatening thing to do in terms of the medieval male's idea of himself, because he's there to have sex with women. What you don't need is someone else coming in and taking his place. But you do get it. I mean, it starts to, the idea as well about women who would know, because there were lots of them, women who would know which plants to use to get rid of unwanted fetuses, or plants to take before you were having sex in order to stop impregnation. That begins to get mixed up with the idea of witchcraft, and they start to get, put to death, really, across Europe.
So one thing that interests me here with regard to the male reaction, right, where they feel threatened. So the part that makes me question that a little bit is that by and large, women are going to be using their sex toys privately. And so the man, her husband, even if he knows that she's doing it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the neighbor is going to know that she's doing it. He's not
Yeah.
publicly losing face as being cuckolded by this sex toy,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, it's a fair
So
point.
that plays a major dynamic into it, but it sounds like above and beyond any concerns about reputation, it's just that pure raw instinct of just between them. He doesn't want it happening, and it's a patriarchal society, so he can enforce the norms that he wants.
Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, if we're talking about medieval Europe, on paper, yes, it was many ways patriarchal, but when you get into it, it's not so much. There are exceptions to it. Women carved out existences for themselves, sometimes extremely rewarding, at all levels of life. It is a very common idea, though, that women were generally very sinned against in the Middle Ages. And while it has traction in certain aspects, for example, in theology and things like that, in terms of day-to-day existence, the wives of, say, a medieval burgher, artisan, lived what to us be a very independent life. They often worked. They could sometimes, to a certain extent, choose the amount of children they had. They often ran their husband's workshops when he was away. So they had their own income. It's quite, I mean, it is to many extents patriarchal, but it also isn't. It's very, very complex. And it depends a lot of the time on where you are within Europe. There are very different attitudes. But in terms of women using sex toys, there's not much on it, to be honest. In the Middle Ages, there really isn't.
Sure.
What we go on a lot of the time is ancient stuff. And it becomes a lot more prevalent in the early modern period. People like John Rochester are talking about importing dildos from Italy into England and stuff, and all kinds of stuff for his orgies. But I think the idea, the very idea of being a man in the Middle Ages precluded your wife finding pleasure elsewhere. It is a form of adultery in that sense, and I think. Also, the idea of pleasure in sex is not seen as necessary because thanks to the teachings of the church. So in many ways, pleasure in sex wasn't a good thing. So they would try to avoid it if they were good Catholics. But as I've said, the world is many and varied, and we can't really assume that couples didn't choose to do that themselves, much as couples would do today. They're not really that different from us in many ways. So it's personal choices. It's about what people like to do to get the rocks off. It would have been seen as deviant behaviour, but that didn't stop anyone anyway. If we see the amount of prohibitions against anal sex in the Middle Ages, it seems quite a lot of people were at it. Excuse me. So
that brings up a question that I had. So far we've been talking pretty exclusively about women using sex toys. What about the history of men using sex toys?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's that's even more kind of less easy to find. Because really, I mean, because homosexuality was not something that people talked about or indulged in without running a risk in a lot of places. There are very famous instances of there's a man called John Reichener in 14th century London. He may have been transgender. We're not entirely sure. He certainly was transsexual. He would dress as a woman and go and sleep with men. But that kind of homosexual history is very, very difficult to find, actually. But yeah, who's to say men didn't do it? Who's to say? No one. They absolutely could have done it. I mean, there's no doubt many people have been doing it. There are queer histories that are slowly and surely being uncovered. Some eras of history are richer in it than others. But yeah, absolutely. If people were gay in the Middle Ages, or even if a man wanted to use it on his wife, within the sanctity of their bedroom or someone else, absolutely. There's no reason to say they didn't.
So I'm curious. I'm curious. So we talked about men potentially using sex toys as a penetrator. But what about sex toys that you penetrate? So have we found anything That would be the ancient or medieval equivalent of like a blow-up doll or something.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are. I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, there's all this kind of fablo and stuff about people using other people, as decoys in bed and stuff. So in the sense it's a blow-up doll, it's a real person who's probably a servant, But no, not. I mean, you do get. I mean, okay, so the obvious recourse for people who can't have access to living thinking human beings is bestiality, and you do get that. That does happen because people do talk about it in law codes and kind of guides to sin. So there are punishments to be handed out for kind of bestiality. I mean, it is seen as an appalling thing, and it does go on. But I mean, anyone who's grown up in the countryside, I mean, my my friend grew up beside a bloke who was overly fond of his goats. He liked a goat and liked their company, and was discovered one day liking the company a bit too much. So that did happen, of course, and as it still happens today. But again, there's no way of, there's no way of particularly knowing. There's a few references, I think, in France, especially to people who were quite fond of their horses and stuff. But I mean, you've got people today who marry their horses. I mean, that's astonishing. So that's something that's always been there in human nature, and no doubt, I mean, was there before. But also, you're talking about a period that used to put animals on trial. So it's quite different to what we understand in that sense. I mean, animals weren't thought of as having a soul, so they were sort of seen as playthings in that sense. I mean, it's appalling. But yeah, so that did go on. Absolutely. There's always been, perverts since the beginning of time. Why not in the Middle Ages? I'm sure there were loads of them. But the thing is, I think what's important from that is the idea that people have an idea, usually about the Middle Ages, that it was all about repressed sexuality and, people shagging sheep because they couldn't get their hands on a woman. That's not the way it was, really. I mean, people were having loads of sex before marriage, having lots of partners, and minding, trying not to get pregnant. Anal sex was a way of not getting pregnant as well, as was interfemoral sex between the thighs. So they're used as well in order to try and increase people's options.
I'll have to see what the keyword is that you have to search to find interfemoral porn.
I wouldn't use it on a work computer, I'll put it that way. I wouldn't search for interfemoral. So you find them, penitentials. There's loads of really good penitentials. My favourite one, and this is his real name, is written by an Irish monk called Cummin. Nice. And he wrote...
the rapper?
Huh?
The rapper?
No, his name is Cummin. That's his name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a rapper named Common.
Oh, really? Do you think he's adopted it because of his love of early Irish saints? It's possible.
It's possible.
It's possible.
I don't know the guy, but if I meet him, I'll ask him.
Please ask him. And maybe has he read Cummin's Penitential, which is basically all about not having sex with boys in the monastery. Please don't have sex with boys in the monastery. Just have sex occasionally with boys in the monastery and then say sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So yeah, there's the history of sex toys dips a little bit in the Middle Ages because we only find people like that poor German woman who was put to death for her strap-on occasionally. So we know it's happening, and then it ups a little bit in the early modern period, 16th, 17th centuries, when everyone gets quite raunchy publicly. So you, again, I mentioned you see Rochester running around having orgies, ordering it. And
tell me more.
Oh well,
tell me more about that.
He's a notorious rake. So he organises orgies and writes about ordering in dildos from Italy because they're supposed to be the best ones because the Italians supposedly knew a thing or two about dildos. So there's that, that goes on. But then, of course, in 17th century, Italy was like the home of sex with Venice and its courtesans. So everyone wanted to go there and lose their virginity or whatever, have a go on a courtesan doing the grand tour. So there's that. Certain places become aligned with sex. We have it today. We have it in the West. People, any kind of balding 50-something overweight bloke who suddenly decides he loves the sights and sounds of Thailand, that's really suspect, isn't it? You're like, I don't think you're over there for the temples, mate. So we have, you have that still. You have a kind of a seedy type who'll take full advantage of the sex trade in more vulnerable communities. So that's nothing new again. You've always had that too. Yeah, he would import his dildos and have a great old time at orgies. And of course, that period, 17th, 18th centuries, is when you get the things like the Hellfire Clubs, which is like gatherings of upper class men who would be up to all sorts, particularly with female servants and prostitutes, and just basically act out.
So to bring the topic back to sex toys,
yeah.
So far, over the span of history that we've covered here, we've talked about prehistoric era. Some think that maybe we found some objects that could have been used as sex toys, but that's maybe probably bunk.
Well, yeah,
then we've got some images from ancient Egypt that could depict women using sex toys. We've got Greece using kind of leather dildos that are lubed with olive oil, right? And then the medieval period, do we know what kind of sex toys, like what kind of object it would have been in the medieval period?
If women were using anything, it was probably much like the Greek one. So it would have been leather and then stuffed with something soft like wool.
All right.
It's interesting. I mean, if you look at later studies like Masters and Johnson and stuff, they talk about women orgasming on sex toys like 30 times more than they would with sex with a man. So there's obviously a value to be had in it, which women have recognised through the years, and particularly if you're living in a society where, people didn't always stick to the rules, but some people did, and if you did stick to the rules, it meant that your life was a sexual wasteland because it was a desert. You could only have sex with your husband if you got married. You could only do it in the missionary position. There's lots of folklore about if you do it doggy style or whatever, you'll have deformed children and things like that, or you'll have bad luck. So you're very limited. There's only a certain amount of time, certain few days that you can actually have sex. So you can have sex on a Sunday, you can have sex on a Friday, you can have sex if it's a church holiday, you can have sex for Easter. There's masses of times you can't have sex. So in that sense, if you stuck to the rules, and you wanted to do it right, you were kind of limited. And maybe, and it doesn't always have to be a sex toy, maybe it's just your hands, I'm sure people did indulge themselves a little bit once they actually discovered what could happen when you got one.
Oh, you find that out right away. Yeah,
but I mean, no one wrote about it. We only find out about stuff like that when people are like arrested for producing dildos and stuff, and that's really rare. So I mean, if you look at the sources, you're going to think to yourself, oh, no one did it. But when you can't always go by that, because a lot of the history of this stuff is hidden. I mean, a lot of the history of any kind of sex history is hidden and has been until quite recently. I mean, it's really only very recently that people are talking about their sexual habits and things like that. And I mean, in many places, we've only just decriminalised homosexuality quite recently. So there's still quite a lot of catching up to do. We're still quite, in some countries, it's still quite medieval, not to use it as a pejorative term, but talk about, they don't want to talk about sex, they don't want to address sexual matters. So it's no surprise that in a much more repressive time, and in a non-literate time, people didn't write it down. But there's certainly instances of people using sex toys, dildos, in the Middle Ages, in the ancient world, right the way through. It may have been limited by status in society, by class, by wealth. It's hard to know. But what is interesting is there's a groundswell, particularly of women from the bottom up, who knew about stuff like forms of contraception which are natural. So if they're going to know about stuff like that, they may well know about other aspects of the human body, the human female body, that need attention. So it's, it's a possibility, is all I'm saying. But yeah, I mean, it begins to be much stricter. Church begins to be less forgiving of things like the use of dildos or prostitution. It all gets pretty nasty towards the end of the Middle Ages. There's a big sea change. We see it in the putting women on trial for witchcraft and stuff like that, and the church gets more militant.
That's very interesting. Well, we're coming up on time here.
Cool.
So with our last few minutes, let's bring this to the present day and
Cool.
see how this plays out. So, we've got medieval sex toys. We've covered that. Then we move on into, say, the Enlightenment period. We've talked about Rochester, for example. You said the Italian dildos were magnificent, right?
Best.
Then when we get into, say, the 19th century, for example, another thing that we turned up in our research on hysteria is that the vibrator is invented not for women's pleasure, but to help doctors not have such a crampy wrist from manually stimulating women to paroxysm.
Well, I think it's designed for other stuff as well, though, isn't it? So, I mean, you get vibrators and they're used on, muscle groups because, it's all that. It's not just about kind of masturbating women. So it is used like that, and they're often sold like that. I mean, vibrators are interesting because they change. They fluctuate as to what they're used for. And then, of course, in the 19th century, you get, rubberization. So it's dildos a go-go. Anyone can have a bloody dildo.
And the other purposes can be used as cover for what the person's really going to use it for, right?
Oh, yeah. You're like, oh, I've got a really sore back. I'll get a vibrator. Yeah, okay. We know what that's for, pumping away on the vibrator there. I mean, it's steam powered ones and everything, didn't they? It was all astonishing. But of course, electricity is there and then, it takes off. But yeah, it is a bit that. I mean, they're sold in a roundabout way, aren't they? It's all that kind of coy. Oh, do you have hand pain? Why don't you get this? And they use really, really odd quasi-sexual language in selling them as well. So you're like, what is actually going on here? Is this thing going to have sex with my hand? I don't really understand what this is. What is actually going on here? I don't want to have sex. I don't want my hand to have sex here. Interestingly, have you seen the feet that are also a vagina? Have you seen that?
No.
For foot fetishists. I saw it the other day on Twitter. God. It's like a pair of feet cut off at the ankle. Astonishing. And then somewhere in it is a fake vagina. Well, not a real one, obviously. But I just thought, blimey, I think we've reached the peak of late capitalism now. I think we need to get off this boat because that's astonishing. You don't even need a face to go along with the feet anymore. Okay. Vibrators are interesting. But, it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which I find really, really astonishing about sex toys, particularly for women. Of course, gay and straight men use them also. That's fine. But I think in terms of women and the way they're marketed to women, I find that really interesting. Because there is still that kind of coyness about it. It's really odd. I mean, I've been at parties where they're being sold, and I've been at parties. I read something the other day, and this woman I was at a sex party, and there were these. It was actually in America, and they were ringing their husbands to check if they could buy them. I'm sorry, what? Why would you ring your what? I'll buy a dildo, thanks. You can shove it. I mean, why would anyone do that? But there's still that whole, oh well, it's a little treat for her, and they were all having this conversation of like, well, I'd only use it with my husband. Well, why would you do that? Because the whole point of it is. So you don't have to use it with him in that sense. You can if you want, but you can also use it when he's not there. But
it's saving face.
It's just like, what? Why are you playing all these little games about hiding the fact that as women they want sexual fulfillment, and that's still seen as a kind of something to be hidden, especially if you're a wife and a mother, and well, it's the whole Madonna whore thing. But anyway, but it's seen as something to not. I mean, I don't know because I don't imagine men are particularly coy about stuff that they get up to themselves. I don't think we've seen a backlash
but I think
about wanking.
I think the comparison can be there because men clearly compete with each other for sexual status, and I'm not surprised if women compete with each other similarly. I mean, you would think at a party like that, it's all women there, nobody has to put on any masks,
well, that's
right?
it.
But you're still competing with other women to be like, yeah, but I'm just a little bit more the Madonna than the whore than you are.
Why compete to be that, though? This is what's interesting. It's like this very ancient idea, do you kiss your children with that mouth? Do you know that kind of thing? It's like, oh, well, and it's all this, what I find very interesting as well is the narrative, particularly with women in the developed West, and it must happen around the world as well, this idea like, sex is a real chore, isn't it, girls? that's interesting to me as well, because that excludes other voices, but it fits into that narrative of being a good girl, of marrying, and what we went back to in the Middle Ages of only enjoying certain kinds of sex at certain times, because that's what good girls do. Good girls don't go and buy as many rubberized dildos as they can, or plug in their vibrators and go for it. And are open about it. I mean, I went to university with a woman who basically would buy dildos and regular. I mean, she'd be like, I wore it down to a knob. I mean, we'd be like, all right, good job, great, whatever. But she's quite open. I was brilliant. I'd go dildo shopping with her, but when I would go dildo shopping with her, it was kind of cutesy. It was weird. I remember going into one shop with her, and there was like a male dildo section for like the men to buy, and they were all like black and shiny and mahogany. And then the women's section was all like unicorns and dildo shaped as tulips. And I was like, literally, are you 7? What is this? What are you doing? And it was like, what is that? Why would I? Thanks, I'll have the big silver bullet in the corner, please. It's like, oh no, I'm sorry, that's only for the men. Oh. Right. I mean, that's the kind of idea. Oh, no, I'll just get this dildo shaped like a tulip and pretend I don't have a sex life. That's fine. Thanks. So again, are we very far away from the strictures laid down by a church 1,000 years ago? I think in some parts of the world we're getting there. I think in other parts of the world we're still back, maybe a step ahead, even in the developed West, which is astonishing. So I think we all have to talk as much about dildos as possible and its long and illustrious history, and say to people, men and women, if you want to go and buy a big black silver-headed dildo in a sex shop, or even a tulip one, boys, then just go and do it and enjoy. And Chinese cock rings or whatever you want, just go for it. And ignore the strictures of dead old men who knew all about women and their wants and needs. That's my message to the world.
Beautiful. You heard it first here, folks, on the history of sex. And I think we'll cap it off there.
Let's finish there. I've buried my career. It's okay. It's fine.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. Gillian, Kenny, thank you for being on
Brandon.
the show. That
Thanks
was
so
awesome.
much.
Before we go, is there anything that you would like to plug? And no pun intended there.
Hey! Oh, do you know we didn't get onto butt plugs, did we? Oh, well, space for another day. No, not really. What am I doing? People can catch me on Twitter if they like. There's a lot of that kind of content, which I tend to put out. So
And you are...
At Medieval Jill.
Right, at Medieval Jill, and that's Jill with a G, right?
Yeah, that's me.
Yep.
So check in to see me there.
In fact, your current avatar I just checked out is actually it's like a female reproductive system.
Yes,
with
it
one
is.
Fallopian tube giving the middle finger.
Yes, it is, Brandon. That says everything. That's my brand. That's my brand now.
Yep.
That's on brand for me. It's fallopian tubes giving the finger. That's everything you need to know about me.
Excellent. Well, that's it for today, folks. Check out Dr. Gillian Kenny on Twitter, where she is at Medieval Jill. If you haven't already, check out our other episode released simultaneously with this one today. It's all the funny skits from our show this year. And that one has animation, so to view that, go to our website at www.historyofsexpod.com. You could support the show by subscribing, rating, and reviewing, or supporting us on Patreon. $5 a month gets you a portrait drawn in the time period and culture of your choosing. I will draw you with a curious cucumber made of leather and oil, or as a debutante at one of Lord Rochester's illustrious parties, or whatever you want. I'll make you look awesome, I promise. Just go to www.patreon.com/BT Newberg. That's patreon.com/BTNEWBERG. I'm BT Newberg, and this is the history of sex. Podcast theme music mixed from tracks by Kevin MacLeod. For additional credits, references, photos, and more, see our website at www.historyofsexpod.com.